South East Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.
Well, the recent RTE scandal and its subsequent scrutiny by the Oireachtas Committees has angered and captivated the nation in equal measure. But did the Oireachtas Committee members ask the right questions? Barry McLoughlin, Head of Client Engagement with the Communications Clinic, joins us now to share his assessment of the Committee's effectiveness. Barry, we'll be discussing a recent article which you wrote about the Oireachtas Committee system and how it can be improved. But first, provide us with an insight into your organisation.
Thanks, Karl. Well, I suppose it's exactly what it says in the tin. We help people with significant communication. So I think one of the things that people would know us a lot from would be preparing people for job interviews, media interviews, presentations, speeches, but also maybe where you have to communicate professionally in a very specific context like a business meeting, or indeed you may have to influence and persuade a stakeholder over a long period of time. So we help people hone their what they want people to remember, think about their audience, and make sure that they're communicating in the most effective way they can with the audience in front of them at that particular time.
And let's focus on job interviews as a starting point here. What are the common mistakes that people make?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think one of the first things that tends to happen is that people will focus very much on describing a lot of activity. So they'll talk a lot about the work they do day to day, maybe in their current job or a previous job. One of the big mistakes they make is they need to think about, well, what did I actually achieve in the job that I am doing or I have done, and how does that relate to the role I'm applying for? So it's thinking about if I was applying for a job at your radio station, for example, I'd want to say, right, okay, well, what are they looking for? What does the job spec say? What are they particularly interested in? And have I got an example that demonstrates I can do that? So a really good example would be if you ask someone, are they good in teams or can they work in a team? And you can go on and give examples about being in teams and enjoying working within a team. But it's actually not really effective unless you're able to say, look, let me tell you how I worked well within a team, what I achieved and why it was relevant to the role that you're actually applying for.
But more and more regulation coming in across all sectors, it's never been as important to be able to communicate effectively with your stakeholders. So in that respect, what advice have you got for businesses that are trying to influence stakeholders, whether they be government departments, government agencies or even regulators?
Yeah, I think the first thing is that you absolutely have to stop thinking about what you want to say and think about what matters to the people you're trying to communicate or influence. And if you think about, you're probably not the only person vying for their attention. So the first thing you think about is, why should they listen to me? How can I make this matter? How can I make this important to the people that I'm engaging with? And secondly, you need to make sure that, particularly if you're in a very technical or a very specific area, that you're speaking the language of the people you're trying to persuade and influence. So a very simple example would be if you're talking about maybe bringing in a new process or bringing in a new way of doing business, why would it matter to that particular audience? So why does it matter that you want to do things differently? We often have clients who come into us maybe and they're giving a presentation and they've put their life and soul into maybe developing a product or developing a service. And the problem is that they're explaining it from their own point of view rather than the point of view of the person who actually is listening and who they're hoping to persuade.
It's good practical advice, I have to say. Now, another area that you advise clients on a daily basis, of course, is crisis management. What are the top tips you can provide to listeners this morning in that area?
Well, I think the first thing to remember is we have a saying here in the office, don't just do something, stand there. In other words, if a crisis hits, the natural reaction is to panic and start to do things. We need to do something. We need to get something done. But actually, the best thing you can do in a crisis is stand still, assess as quickly as you can and effectively as you can what the issue is, what needs to be done to fix it, and who are the people you need to start communicating to. And that's a really important point because sometimes, people will get into a crisis and the first thing they become aware of it, maybe a journalist or a news outlet contacts them. And they're kind of scrambling on the back foot, wondering how are we going to deal with this. And they feel they need to get a message out early or get a statement out. And actually that can be the worst thing to do. And what you have to think about as well is who are your most important people. So you need to be communicating with your best customers. You need to be communicating with your staff. You need to be communicating with your stakeholders first. They shouldn't be hearing about things in the media that really they should have heard directly from you first.
And Barry, as I mentioned at the beginning of the interview, you recently wrote an article about the Oireachtas Committee system and how it can be improved. With the Public Accounts Committee being in the headlines in recent months regarding RTE and the GAA, PAC was on everybody's radar. But remind us about the function of PAC and how would you assess its recent performance?
Yeah, the function of, I suppose, all the parliamentary committees, and I mean, they have a really important job to do. They're there to do a number of things. So, for example, they will assess legislation before it goes before the House. They'll take in suggestions in relation to various things. So let's say, for example, there's a piece of legislation going through about local media, local radio stations. They'll often invite people in like yourselves or people who run and work in the sector and ask them for their views on what should the law look like, what changes would they make and why. So that's a really important function. They actually invite experts in to give their expert opinion. The second thing they do, and I think this is what we're all more familiar with, it would be where they would hold senior civil servants or stakeholders to account. So, for example, the Public Accounts Committee would regularly have different people in from different government departments questioning how they are spending taxpayers' money, how they're making decisions around policy, why decisions are made a certain way. I think where everyone, I suppose, became aware recently was RTE were brought in, and then Ryan Tubridy and his agent were brought in as well. And again, they were asking some very serious questions around the way RTE was being run, around the way money was being spent, around the way decisions were being made. And I think it's fair to say that, there's a lot more to run on this because certainly they didn't get to the bottom of it, certainly in the first 2 weeks of the questioning and the interrogation.
Now, one of the criticisms which was levelled at the committee was that the questions which the general public wanted answered just weren't asked. But were they restricted by their remit?
They have a system and, they have rules they go by. So, for example, they have rules around, making allegations against people. So there's rules around, what you can say about people as a witness. And, you can get warnings about that. There are also rules around things like, can you comment on specific government policies? And that's very important. I mean, it wouldn't be fair to bring in a civil servant who's following government policy and then criticise them for doing their job. So there are, restrictions and rules on what kind of questions they can ask. I think the big issue is, were the questions that were being asked the right ones? And were they asking enough questions and listening to the answers? And I think it was said to me by somebody, one of the things that was mentioned about the Oireachtas committees that week was that some of the pubs were staying open and people were going in early to sit in and watch the questions and maybe have a drink. And as somebody remarked to me, they heard better questions being shouted from the pub floor at the screen than some of the politicians were asking, which is maybe an indicator that certainly a lot of people felt that some politicians used the question time and the time they'd allocated to make statements, to make allegations, but not actually to ask questions. And I think that was the big issue. There were some of the politicians and some very quiet politicians, and maybe politicians who wouldn't have a high profile, who asked excellent questions, who listened and who followed up and really got to the heart of the matter. And there was a couple of politicians who used their time to remind people what they thought of the issue, to remind people what their views on the people in front of them were, but didn't actually ask a question that allowed us to get further information and understand a little bit more what had actually gone on the last number of years.
And Barry, if Ryan Tubridy and Noel Kelly had approached you in advance of going into those committees, what advice would you have given them?
I think one of the things that to be mindful of when you're in front of a committee is that your approach should always be to be helpful. They have an important job to do, and make sure that you're being helpful, you're detailed in your answers, you have the information to hand, and in many respects they were able to do that. And it's just to be mindful as well as if you don't know the answer to something, you're better off to say you don't know the answer rather than speculate. That can get you into all kinds of trouble.
And in your opinion, are the Oireachtas committees fit for purpose when it comes to unearthing the truth behind matters like this?
Absolutely, I think they are. I mean, they have very wide-ranging powers in terms of dealing with witnesses. But I think it's not so much the committees; it's how the individual people questioning decide to use their time. So there's a couple of things that I'd suggest people would do. First of all, do research in advance and check that what is it they don't understand, what is it they're not clear on, and actually start questioning from that position. If something is not clear, it's actually that point you need to focus on, rather than what you think about the evidence or what you've heard before. Second thing I'd suggest is get straight to your question. Don't try and tell me why you're asking me a question or why your question is so important. Just ask the question. Keep the question short, listen to the answers, and base your next question on the answer you've heard. And I think any of us, of a certain age, if we go back to our teenage years, maybe you snuck in the door late one night and your mother or father were waiting for you when you got in. It was that line of questioning where they weren't angry, they were listening to everything you said, and they followed up with, but tell me that again now, because that's not what you said a few minutes ago. That's the devastating line of questioning that we didn't see enough of as well. A few politicians got quite angry. They raised their voices. They wagged their fingers. And that let everyone know how angry they were. But it actually didn't make any difference really in making the questions more effective. So getting angry and showing you're angry, that's very performative. But is it actually making your questions better? I don't think so. And I think the last thing is, don't ask a question for the sake of it. We saw one of the chairpersons ask a question, I think of Noel Kelly at the very end, where the line of questioning ended up, what did you do for a living? What did you do in Cadbury's? And the answer was, marketed chocolate. And I mean, it was an obvious answer to, a question that actually had no relevance. And I think the better thing to do there would be maybe go back on an answer that maybe had been slightly inconsistent. So go back and the question you answered earlier on from Deputy X or Senator Y, can you maybe just follow up on that? So you're just absolutely nailing down and making sure that the witnesses are being consistent in what they're saying.
It would be amiss if I didn't discuss with you finally artificial intelligence and the impact that this is going to have on communications going forward from a business perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one because I think, it's like everything else. When something is new and shiny, people will either embrace it or be fearful of it. I think that the first thing to remember is that artificial intelligence is just like any other technology. It is only as good as the people operating it. It is only as good as the people putting the information into it. Now, we've seen things. So, for example, there are stories going around of articles been written using AI or pictures been drawn using AI. And I think for the most part, most people can spot something fairly quickly that hasn't been written by a living, breathing human being. I think the one thing I would go back to, though, if you talk about storytelling, the best stories we hear and the stories we remember are the ones that grab our heart and the ones that grab our head. Now, artificial intelligence may grab our head, but I do not remain convinced, and I have not seen any evidence yet, that the things that make us human, the stories, the emotions, the things that matter, I don't think AI is quite there yet. And again, if it does get there, it gets there because people have put in incredible detail, have put in huge amounts of information to make sure they're getting that point across as well.
Well, if you've just tuned in, that was Barry McLoughlin from the Communications Clinic, and I'd like to thank Barry for sharing his analysis and advice with us this morning.
Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.